Hello there, and welcome to Labour Media. Today we're going to be going back to basics a bit and taking a read of The Principles of Communism, a small pamphlet written by Friedrich Engels in 1847 that serves as a brief introduction to communism and a primer on its functions. The work is split into 25 points, however these points have internal trends and can be split into the following sections. What's the proletariat, and a brief explanation of historical materialism, aka how we got here. What are the consequences of capitalist production? How will revolution be carried out? What will the revolutionary society look like? And what is the attitude of communists to their contemporaries? Engels begins by defining communism, calling it the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. But what is the proletariat? To understand that, Engels outlines the development of the proletariat via historical materialism, a system of analysis wherein we see history moving in phases, progressed by material and economic conditions. History can be defined as a series of epochs from primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, and then capitalism. Of course, it's not smooth sailing where one day everyone had slaves and the next day feudal lords were established, but we see this transition has more or less been the standard over the world at various speeds. Each of these epochs have had different classes, save for primitive communism. Each era from slave society to capitalism can be defined by class conflict. The proletariat, therefore, is the working class under capitalism, described by Engels as that class in society which lives entirely from the sale of its labour and does not draw profit from any kind of capital, whose weal and woe, whose life and death, whose sole existence depends on the demand for labour, hence on the changing state of business, on the vagaries of unbridled competition. Engels goes on to explain how the proletariat originates, coming to fruition during the Industrial Revolution and developing out of the prior serf class. Here's a quick rundown of how serfs were replaced by proletarians. Under the feudal mode of production, there were a good number of class complexities. Relevant to us, however, are the serfs, who owned their own tools and land and produced them themselves, their family, and their lord, to whom they owed goods and services alike a form of rent. Then a burgeoning middle class of merchants began to come into power, alongside new machinery sprouting forth from the Industrial Revolution. These machines in their factories took multiple people to operate, so the commodities they produced were made by many rather than one. Thus came the socialisation of labour, wherein multiple labourers were required to create commodities on a grand scale, commodities being goods that are useful but are also designed for exchange, as opposed to the predominant mode under feudalism, wherein what was produced for just use and not exchange. These new factories and firms quickly toppled other existing class forms such as handicraftsmen and manufacturing workers. The handicraftsman, as defined by Engels, became petty bourgeois under capitalism, with Engels saying his goal is to acquire capital himself, wherewith to exploit other workers, whilst the handicraftsmen themselves continued to become more and more proletarian in character, essentially showing how the petty bourgeois were likely, and remain likely today, to be cast back into the proletarian mass after failing to make the grade as a member of the bourgeoisie. The manufacturing worker was much alike the serf, but manufactured rather than engaging in the more agricultural work of the serfs with machinery such as looms. Engels remarks on what became of this class with the manufacturing worker is torn out of his patriarchal relation by big industry, loses whatever property he still has, and in this way becomes a proletarian. The pamphlet remarks how the processes outlined here, the creation and destruction of classes as the mode of production changed, simplify the class conflict into two main classes. The class of capitalists, who had exclusive possession of the means of subsistence and the instruments of production, the bourgeoisie, and the class of workers who are without property and must sell their labour to the bourgeoisie in exchange for the means of subsistence, the proletariat. I must mention here now, though, this class stratification has occurred across the world. There still remains vestiges of the older modes and older classes over the world. We see today that there are contradictions within the classes. Not only has industry centralised from free competition, extant during Marx and Engels' life, to the monopoly stage of capitalism wherein a handful of imperialist countries have partitioned the world, but the proletarian class has seen a split between workers in the imperial core, countries where this stratification happened first, and the workers in the imperial periphery, the poorer countries subjugated by the core countries via imperialism. We've seen the development of a labour aristocracy in the core, workers who receive better conditions under the social democracies of imperial core countries that can exist due to the super profits of their country's governing monopolies. The interests of these workers still align with those of the periphery, but this distinction has led to a diminishment of revolutionary gusto within the core. This topic is beyond the scope of this video, however, so let's carry on to the next section. In this section, points 11 to 13, Engels goes over the Industrial Revolution and its consequences. No, not like that. This is a subject I've covered a lot of my videos, that is how capitalist industry works and the consequences of its functions. In fact, I've often quoted from this pamphlet in my videos on the subject. To give you a rundown, Engels starts by talking about how capitalist production, through its need for constant growth, has toppled the existing status quo. Then he goes on about how this need for growth periodically sinks capitalism into crisis. To quote Engels, big industry created in the steam engine and other machines the means of endlessly expanding industrial production, speeding it up and cutting its cost. With production thus facilitated, the free competition, which is necessarily bound up with big industry, assumed the most extreme forms. A multitude of capitalists invaded industry, and in a short while, more was produced than was needed. As a consequence, finished commodities could not be sold, and a so-called commercial crisis broke out. Factories had to be closed, their owners went bankrupt, and the workers were without bread. Deepest misery reigned everywhere. After a time, the superfluous products were sold, the factories began to operate again, wages rose, and gradually business got better than ever. But it was not long before too many commodities were again produced, and a new crisis broke out, only to follow the same course as its predecessor. Here Engels touches on a few things. The falling rate of profit, a symptom of the need for endless growth, wherein costs and prices get lower and lower until crisis occurs and the whole cycle repeats. Overproduction, the trade cycle, where this crisis period occurs every 5 to 7 years. And anarchy in production, the phenomenon that is a natural byproduct of capitalism. The disorderly nature of markets wherein competitors battle it out without any form of economic plan leads to overproduction and inefficiency, accelerating the march towards crisis. We see these crises very plainly in the UK. The winter of our discontent, the crises under Thatcher's early years, Black Wednesday, the 2008 recession crisis, austerity, COVID, the cost of living crisis, etc. Capitalism, functioning in constant chaos of profit, taken as its solitary incentive, exists in a state tantamount to constant crisis, broken up by the facade of success, a success drawn from the continued misery of workers at home and from the unending war and exploitation in the imperial periphery. Engels breaks down what revolution will involve thusly. Above all, it will have to take the control of industry and of all branches of production out of the hands of mutually competing individuals and instead institute a system in which all these branches of production are operated by society as a whole. That is, for the common account, according to a common plan and with the participation of all members of society. It will, in other words, abolish competition and replace it with association. The abolition of private property, and thus the suppression of the bourgeois class via the new dominance of the working class, is what must be done for revolt. It should be noted that private property refers to property owned by capitalists, as opposed to personal property, property that can be reasonably used by a single individual. To abolish private property is to put the working class in charge of the means of production, for such articles require masses of workers to function and only exist as the sole property of a few for the enrichment of a few, rather than the benefit of all. Engels remarks that this will be a gradual process and it will likely require violent revolution due to the violent reaction of the bourgeoisie. Engels lists 12 points the revolution will require, such as nationalisation and centralisation of industry and agriculture, as well as improved social rights, progressive taxation and heightened industry. The points here are very similar to the 10 found in the Communist Manifesto. Another point here is that Engels says that the revolution will not take place in one country alone. Indeed, socialism is internationalist. Even those of us who believe in the strategy of socialism in one country believe such out of an international need to fortify the success of one revolution so that the global revolution may be supported. The issue here is Engels' outdated belief that it will be in the so-called civilized, though I suspect he means industrialized countries, where revolution will begin, in a more or less simultaneous fashion. England, America, France, Germany are his examples for this as the most industrialized countries at the time, but we have seen that history has not taken the course he is expected. France saw the rise of the 1848 Paris Commune, and Germany eventually saw the DDR, but none of these countries have really had much in the way of progress as Engels here outlines. In fact, Engels would go on to concur with what I'm saying, noting in a letter to Karl Kautsky that the English proletariat is becoming more and more bourgeois. These countries have all seen the development of labour aristocracies, wherein their workers occupy a different position to the workers of the imperial periphery. Capitalism is enshrined here, it is misunderstood, and it is venerated without question by most. Though there is much suggestion of opposition to it, most of this supposed opposition in the core is social democratic, carrying the chauvinistic Western supremacist trappings of typical liberal democratism. I'd recommend my video on the failings of the British left for more on that subject. Safe to say, revolutionism has been far more apparent in Latin America, Africa and Asia. It was the 1917 revolution in Russia that breathed life into revolution across the globe, as opposed to the many failed uprisings of Western Europe that occurred in the early 20th century. Generally, Engels says that the new social order following revolution will be a right lark. No more crises, instead economic planning, abundance for all. People will be free from lives in one miserable position, and education will encourage this newfound opportunity, the opportunity for people to live as people and not as cogs in a machine. Humanity will no longer be sacrificed on the altar of wealth accumulation. We will be free to live, unburdened by the myriad constructs created by capitalist economy to prop up its oppressive regime. The superstructure of society will not tell anyone of any identity who they must be, but rather make everyone independent and able to be themselves. The nation as a concept will dissolve as borders melt away, and people from all over the world see their fellow humans as brethren, no matter their place of origin. Religion, though some may still carry on its traditions, will become superfluous. We will not be sold a better life after death, for we will have created a better life for all here on earth. Snapping this aside, let's take a quick glance at the last points here, as they're not too relevant to us today, save for some choice remarks. The reactionary socialists Engels speaks of here don't seem to exist much today, given that nobody's all too excited to restore a feudal society, but his point about these types ultimately siding with the bourgeoisie is poignant. Indeed, there are those who claim to be socialists but hawk the fascistic ideology of palingenesis, holding reactionary views on social matters and demanding a reversal of progress to supposed times of strong men in conservative society. These types will side with the bourgeoisie on matters of social progress and ultimately their economics, for their chauvinism betrays their liberalism. They're not too relevant to our discussions today, however, but just some food for thought. Bourgeois socialists and democratic socialists, as Engels calls them, can best be described as reformist liberals or social democrats today, who want to trim back the ugly consequences of capitalism without killing capitalism. Engels then references the multiple political factions within numerous industrialised countries that communists can find common cause with. Say that 10 times fast. The Chartists in England were an early proletarian movement that eventually fell into corruption as the Labour aristocracy developed, whilst the national reformers in the US have similarly fallen to the wayside. If we were to look at this today, I would recommend that communists do as many communists are doing and ally themselves with working class organisations such as unions that are a few times removed or many times removed from the bourgeois political parties. There are also many anti-imperialist organisations that do great work that communists across the globe could work with. Outside of that, much needs to be done in terms of creating a communist grouping that is unambiguously communist, beyond working with groups that aren't communist or merely lean communist. Despite its datedness in some areas, I cannot recommend Principles of Communism enough as a brief yet detailed primer on communism. I hope that I've explained and elaborated upon the text well here, but I recommend that everyone who has not read the pamphlet read it. Maybe recommend it to others if you think you could sway them too. Who knows? It might just show them that communism is much more reasonable than they once assumed.